Everyone, hope you guys are well. I'm FPL Fran, and today's video is going to be the Game Week 13 preview. Today, what we're going to be looking at is all the sort of key positional transfers that you could look for in terms of Game Week 13, and then my thoughts on captaincy, and then second of all, just a general thought point on why I don't think free hit 13 makes any sense. I have seen it recommended by some players, usually unfortunately more casual players, so I don't think that many people were really thinking about it, but just wanted to reiterate why some people, might be considering it and why it's probably best to avoid it. So starting with the sort of positional transfers this week, I wanted to touch on the midfield position. I think this is the position where we might actually see quite a lot of activity because over the last few game weeks, we have been investing into some players outside of, let's say, Mbumo. If anything, a lot of us have actually moved off of Mbumo, but now we're very close to a sort of time period where investing back into Mbumo does make sense. So that is one option. Now, however, what I would say is that there are other appealing options that have come up in the meantime. So if you guys remember when we were talking about game weeks 8/10 wildcards, around that time, we were very interested in Eze. And of course, Eze unfortunately was injured. However, he is now back. He basically played off the bench in his first game back and then the full 90 minutes in the previous game versus Everton. So it's very clear now that Eze is a pick that we can go back into. Yes, of course, he blanked for most of game weeks 1 to 5 and was very, very, dismaying as an asset. But I don't really think that, the rule about past points really means anything. Eze still on paper still looks like a very interesting pick. And for that reason, I think Eze is a very good transfer for this week, particularly since the fixture is just so good, right? Starting off with a fixture like Luton away is perfect. Now, of course, someone like Salah had blanked in Luton away, but if you look at the chances that Salah got, or even the chances that Darwin missed from Salah, then of course you can tell that still Liverpool, for example, their XG being something like 3+, can tell you that, of course, this Luton team is still nowhere near what we really would expect, right? And for that reason, perfect landing point to jump onto Eze. Now, the other pick, of course, that we've been already mentioning for the last few weeks is Bowen. Hey everyone, this is Fran from the future here. Unfortunately, it seems like, of course, Bowen has a injury, and the injury doesn't seem to be long-term, right? It might even be the case that Bowen is ready for the next fixture in Game Week 13. He has withdrawn from the English national team, so it might be the case that Bowen is just sort of taking a precautionary move. I think Southgate intonated as much. So when you listen to thoughts about Bowen in the video, of course, do recognize that I understand that there's an injury, but keep in mind, of course, that he still might be available for the rest of the weekend. As far as Mitoma, though, it does seem like he might not be ready for Game Week 13. So, of course, that is a cause of concern. If you're interested in, let's say, a very, very short-term transfer from Mitoma, I think the simplest move to say is that you can just go for Eze and Mbumo, or basically as suggested in the video. So thank you guys so much for watching, and continue on. And Bowen is still a very, very good pick. We got news that Antonio got injured on international duty with Jamaica, so it's very likely that Bowen continues to play in that center forward position. But that also opens up the differential, right? If you were interested in Kudus as an option, he probably is even more strengthened, right? Because previously we said that maybe investing to Kudus last week didn't make too much sense because Paqueta was someone who was just suspended, right? And therefore that allowed Kudus to play 90 minutes. Now, with Antonio being out injured again, that probably allows for Kudus to actually play one of the positions in the attacking places now that Bowen can actually move up front, right? And that's going to be huge for Kudus. And I think those two picks are still very, very much firmly within my radar. And that's what I would say. On the other hand, I'd like to also talk about a lot of people trying to, for example, go out of Son. And for me, that doesn't make too much sense. I think Son still has incredible fixtures. And for me, Son is also so good on Game Week 18, where I would generally think about holding Son up until Game Week 18, and then you can reconsider, right? Because yes, of course, he's going to the Asian Cup, which is, of course, the competition that, South Korea, his national team, will be competing in around the same time as AFCON. And around that time, we have to be, getting out of Mbumo, getting out of Salah, getting out of Son. And that complicates things. But if anything, I would actually say probably when you look at, let's say, Game Week 18, probably a good landing point to jump off of Salah. And then obviously you can also reconsider maybe going out of Son on Game Week 19, something like that. Or you can just simply wait until Game Week 20/21 when he's basically going to be out of the picture. Game Week 20, we still expect Son to be there. Same with Salah. And for that reason, I think Salah out on Game Week 18 makes more sense, but we'll get a little bit more clarity around that time. So I do think Son is still a great hold. And the argument has always been about, Maddison, of course, is the creative beacon of the Spurs team. And I completely agree. When you look at even underlying stats, the expected assists of Maddison have been incredible. But one thing I would also mention is when you look at football teams and when you look at key creators leaving, that doesn't always change completely the landscape of a football team. Yes, of course, for example, City have struggled with KDB being out. A team like Man United without Bruno would obviously lose a huge creative beacon, but it doesn't mean that they're going to stop scoring goals. And that's the first thing I'd like to point out. Son has always been someone who doesn't need an incredible amount of chances to be hugely benefiting from situations where some key players would have left. For example, you can see even in the context of Kane, a very creative player that Son used to play with, he's been able to do well so far. And given the fact that he's also going to be on 100% of penalties, I think that's a huge plus. Spurs this season haven't had any penalties, so that should be a huge addition to why keeping Son actually still makes a lot of sense. So that's the midfield position for me. And in terms of those sort of picks like Mitoma, Diaby, Adingra, personally, I think Adingra is still a great hold. And the reason why Adingra is a great hold is because I don't really see the need to invest into Cole Palmer, until really game week 14. If you don't invest into Eze now, I can understand going towards Palmer, trying to capitalize on price rises. But you can't look at those Chelsea fixtures and say, I expect Cole Palmer to score penalties in all these fixtures, which might be possible based on the sort of rate that he's going at. But in reality, right, even though Cole Palmer actually has really good underlying stats outside of the penalties, he's actually been one of the key sort of chance creators within the Premier League so far in his limited time out. But I still think that these fixtures are very tough, so it's very hard to actually foresee that Cole Palmer is going to have that much value. Someone like Adingra or Mitoma, who's probably going to play Nottingham Forest away, is still a very good hold for this week. Whereas with Diaby, I think the concern with Diaby is a positional one, where now that actually you have a full-strength Aston Villa team and Tielemans is coming back into the side, it's not necessarily the case that Tielemans is a like-for-like replacement with Diaby. That's not the case. It's more so the case that, for example, the four attacking players who used to share minutes actually were three. It was Zaniolo, Bailey, and Diaby, right? And Diaby usually would sort of not be a part of that rotation. It's more so the case that we would see Zaniolo come off and then Bailey come on for Zaniolo. But we do know that Bailey can sort of play the role that Diaby does. And even though he might not, for example, play a necessary sort of centre-forward-esque role that Diaby does play for the team can actually play around effectively Ollie Watkins as the sole striker. And that's what we've seen in some games recently. And now with Tielemans actually coming into the side, you're seeing that actually the minutes are now being sort of split between those four players. Just have a look at Aston Villa's last two fixtures and see the substitutions. It's actually very clear now that Diaby's minutes, in my opinion, are under threat. Now, coming after the international break, it might be the case that Diaby puts on a great performance. And of course, now that Spurs are so weak from a defensive point of view, you can definitely say that. But I still think it's quite risky with the minutes, and because Tielemans has played well so far and actually found his way back into getting minutes within the first team, I do think Diaby is actually one that you should definitely consider selling now. Whereas, for example, someone like Foden, who always, we always ascribe, let's say, minutes risks with Pep, I still think his minutes are still relatively safe, even though, of course, he's prone to a rest and a bench, because this is what happens when you play for Man City. But those are my immediate thoughts. In terms of other budget transfers, I also think Johnson is one on the radar, but keep in mind, of course, that he actually has a Man City fixture coming up soon, so you do need someone to actually plug that hole in game week 14. So whether you consider Johnson to make a lot of sense for your team, that's another question. In terms of Gordon, I myself have been owning Gordon all this time, but I've always said that I think he's a little bit overrated, just because we do expect, let's say, Isaac to come back from the international break, and ultimately, unfortunately, even though these fixtures look good for Gordon playing centre forward, the fixtures aren't good, right? Because even though you have a centre forward, you're still playing him in very, very tough fixtures, and that's not going to be great. So those are my immediate thoughts. I also think that ultimately, if you're, let's say, saving transfers, holding for, let's say, a Chelsea player like Palmer or Sterling, then feel free to do so. Wait until game week 14 and exercise that transfer. But for now, in the meantime, I do think Eze and the West Ham picks make a lot of sense. Now, moving on towards the forward position, I think this is another category where, once again, I would actually generally recommend holding your picks, because in the sort of high price positions, like let's say Watkins, Alvarez, or even let's say Darwin, if you own these players, then fair enough, keep all of them for now, because I think with Darwin, this is going to be a tough fixture. You just look at it on paper, game week 13 versus City, that's a tough game. But you can move on beyond that, and Darwin actually becomes a very good hold. Not only that, but actually Darwin seems like a keep for the long term, just because when we look at, let's say, game week 18, yes, of course, it's a very tough fixture versus Arsenal. But if you, let's say, plan to sell Salah, then actually it makes sense to sell Salah and anticipate, of course, that he's going to AFCON. Darwin's going to be enjoying a lot more minutes within this Liverpool team. I really struggle to see how during AFCON he isn't the one who actually clocks the most amount of minutes in the forward positions for this Liverpool team. So therefore, I think Darwin is an amazing hold. As far as Watkins, he just seems like a great hold, because game week 18, he's class. And then game week 13 and 14 are still good fixtures. Now, particularly because of the injuries and the suspensions to the Spurs team. Udogie's coming back, but that doesn't mean anything for Romero, doesn't mean anything for Van de Ven. So that's going to be a huge impact for Watkins, and therefore I think Watkins is quite an easy hold. The next time I would actually consider selling Watkins is game week 15, but that's only if you have the luxury to, let's say, move into Darwin. Now, of course, you can also move Watkins to Darwin on game week 14 as well, even though Watkins actually has a really good picture on paper himself. I just think it's such a good window, because actually what happens is that fixture is effectively, if you see Darwin starting for game week 14 versus Fulham, then you get to capitalize hopefully on minutes versus Sheffield United away. Now keep in mind 14, 15, 16 is extremely congested for both Aston Villa and Liverpool, but Darwin has actually improved in terms of how many minutes we can really expect, and how much it is the case that he is the first string sort of center forward within that team. And I do think because the landscape has changed from a Jurgen Klopp point of view, and you can even listen to, for example, Linders talk about Darwin and his defensive role in the team and how he's completely understood the pressing element side of things with Liverpool, I do think that that makes sense. You're at least doing a side grade on Game Week 14, and maybe, of course, the money that you save with, let's say, moving from Watkins to Darwin in the short term can enable you some pretty powerful moves before Game Week 18. But I do think, for example, because so many big guns will be leaving in AFCON, it does make sense to actually eventually move into a 3-4-3 structure around Game Week 18. So that's around the time where you can actually, if you're considering to keep Watkins, keep him the whole time anyways. Whereas if you, let's say, move from Watkins to Darwin on Game Week 14, you can therefore pick up Watkins back. But instead of actually going Darwin to Watkins out, you can actually just go for a 3-4-3 around that time, anticipating that a lot of the big guns will be leaving FPL. Another thing to mention as to why you should hold your budget for the more expensive premium players in the forward position is we know that Nkunku's coming back as well. And I do think it is worth maybe just assessing what exactly happens with the Chelsea team versus Newcastle. What are they going to do? Does Nkunku start immediately, or does he come off the bench? And do we expect him to get really, really good minutes in the future? Because ultimately, saving up for Nkunku might make a lot more sense. Now, if you're in the budget territory and you really need someone, or let's say you're not going to free at 18 and you actually own Alvarez, and fair enough, you actually want to move Alvarez out of the team, then I can understand moving out of Alvarez on Game Week 13. And why is that the case? Because we've got Solanke here, who basically starts off with a perfect fixture himself, with basically Sheffield United away, and you can just enjoy Solanke's pretty clean run of games. The only bad fixture he really has on the radar, I would say, is probably Game Weeks 15 and 16, those two combined. But Solanke is generally quite a good hold, and of course, at that sort of budget price at 6.4, he's really only competing with Taiwo Awoniyi. So it's a question of, do you think that Taiwo Awoniyi is going to benefit from playing for maybe a slightly stronger attack with Nottingham Forest, but not being a penalty taker, and sometimes being able to be taken off for someone like Chris Wood, who's probably going to come back from injury soon, versus Solanke, who's purely a 90 minutes man, a penalty taker, and even scored a brace versus Newcastle. So those are my thoughts. I do think Solanke is the clear option, and I think I would consider moving into him. Another pick to consider why you should hold in your transfer is, why not maybe think about a transfer in the future for someone like Isaac on Game Week 17? If Wilson seems to be out for the long term, then Isaac is actually a really good transfer in Game Week 17, and maybe you can actually just hold your pick. No need to waste transfers in the forward positions. Try to, for example, survive with Watkins in the meantime, and then you can reconsider with someone like Isaac, right? If you really have no confidence, for example. But I do think Watkins is one of those picks where ultimately, because of the landscape of the forwards, where I think 3-4-3 will be quite meta at around AFCON, I do think Watkins is probably a hold, because you're also holding a lot of price value tied into Watkins, right? A lot of us have invested into Watkins in previous weeks before he became 8.4 million. And therefore, it actually makes sense to probably hold that value in Watkins, because he's so valuable for Game Week 18. And then also during the time where a lot of players, unfortunately, will be leaving FPL. So those are my thoughts on Watkins. As far as the defender position, I think this is one of those weeks where, once again, you have to really consider that this might be a week to roll your transfer. Now, a lot of us do own Matty Cash, and I think that he's one of the few picks where you can generally consider transferring out. And why I say this is because, at least for the defensive positions, the fixtures are so bad for so many good teams, and unfortunately the only good team, in my opinion, that really has good defensive fixtures is Arsenal and Liverpool. Arsenal in the short term for the next 3 game weeks, and then Liverpool just in general, because they actually seem to be one of the top defenses. I know a lot of people might find it hard to agree with this, but the underlying stats would suggest the same. Remember that a lot of those early season games too, they were playing 10 versus 11 or even 9 versus 11. So I think that Liverpool have shown to be a very, very impressive defense, and investing into the defense makes sense, but they're so expensive. So in a sense, Liverpool's defense have been priced out of the question with outside of Tsimikas, where I do think it's still worth maybe keeping Tsimikas in your team as your 4/5th defender and to hold them as a budget pick. Now, as far as, let's say, picks within the Arsenal team, I do think, for example, going from Cash to Saliba is a very, very good transfer, right? Because ultimately, Saliba is the only pick within this Arsenal team that gives you the guarantee of minutes at a certain price point. Whereas with Cash, if you want guaranteed Aston Villa minutes, all you have to do is move towards Konsa at 4.5. So that's why I think it makes a lot more sense to go from Cash to Saliba. If you just want guaranteed minutes, you want a defender who can actually hopefully cover decently in terms of game weeks 13, 14, and 15, and then you can actually reconsider Cash. Because one of the reasons why we say Cash is good and why we considered him so far out is because Cash always had a very good game week 18. But if you're actually looking for budget in the short term and you don't really care about Cash so much because his underlying stats in terms of the attacking point of view have started to decline. Initially, he started the season very hot at an XG per 90 of over 0.4, which we knew was unsustainable. Right now, of course, it's sort of mellowed out a bit. It's now at 0.28. But I do think, of course, we can expect that to continue to drop because I don't think Cash has really been posting any sort of effective games, whilst Aston Villa have actually continued to be a very strong attack. And that's why you can see, for example, in one of the Nottingham Forest games, for example, that they were preying on Matty Cash overlapping as a defender and therefore leaving a lot of space in behind in that right back position. So I do think that this Aston Villa team will probably acclimate from a tactical point of view to that. And of course, Cash is going to be still an attacking asset. You need to recognize that you're losing an attacking asset, but you might also have the guarantee of minutes for Aston Villa and also the guarantee of a very good fixture for game week 18, even by just saving a bit of money and going for someone like a Konsa or even a Pau Torres at 4.6. So those are one of the picks I'd suggest. Another topic, of course, is going to be, can you go simply from someone like Cash to Lascelles? Now, that actually makes sense to me, but unfortunately, we still haven't had true and real confirmation that Botman is going to be out for the long term, because I've heard conflicting reports and so far no outlet has really confirmed that, nor has Eddie Howe. What we know so far is that Sven Botman has been seeking external advice all this time for an injury that has been nagging him all this time, which has obviously precluded him from playing Premier League football. Not only that, but it seems to be the case that he's also looking for a secondary opinion on whether he needs surgery or not. Now, of course, if he pursues a surgery or a surgical route, that is going to take Botman out of action for an extremely long time, and that makes Lascelles an incredible pick in FPL because it just means that we can save so much money and still bank on having a Newcastle defender. Now, if that's not the case, then it might be the case that Botman could be back very, very shortly, but we still have no confirmation that that's the case. We did get a report that Botman was running on grass, but after that, we also got news that Botman's injury might keep him out for a long time. And so this is why I think it's still very uncertain. And the best case scenario, in my opinion, is saving that transfer for now, waiting for any news that Eddie Howe can give us. And maybe if he provides us with definitive news and a definitive timeline of Botman, then we can move on to Lascelles. I can also understand managers just simply wanting to go for Lascelles to save themselves a little bit of money, but do recognize, of course, that there's going to be a risk added to that. As far as Livramento, another pick that we hyped up recently, he's going to definitely play in that Chelsea fixture because I believe Lewis Hall is on some sort of loan to buy deal. And even though the deal is going to be made permanent, I still believe for the case of this season, it's probably likely that Lewis Hall will not play versus Chelsea. And for this reason, Livramento is probably going to play left back. And that's why there's going to be an advantage for the people who moved into Livramento last week, even though it didn't look so good because Lewis Hall played 45 minutes, that Livramento is going to play. And simply, as we were saying in the previous video, we knew that Livramento is almost a short-term risk compared to Lascelles. But you might have some medium-term advantages because, of course, if Livramento can prove to play extremely well versus Chelsea, and given the fact that he's actually played much better, when he played right back in the EFL Cup fixtures and also in the Champions League, that he might just take away that left back spot for the short term over Lewis Hall. So that's going to be something to sort of stay tuned on and look at. But that's going to be the positional transfers for this week. As far as captaincy, what I would like to mention is that I don't think we have great captaincy options this week. Unfortunately, the captaincy options are probably between Haaland, who already has an asterisk sort of ascribed to him just because of the international break injury, which seems to be a reoccurrence of a certain ankle injury that he's been suffering from since that Bournemouth game, if you guys recall him being 45-minute or halftime subbed. So that's one of the issues that we're dealing with, Haaland with an asterisk. And then obviously, I think Son is one of those captaincy options that we have to consider. Yes, of course, Spurs look terrible. Yes, of course, they barely created any chances versus Wolves, if we're being completely serious. I still think, though, that this is still a Spurs team that have still accumulated enough XG for us to say that they're quite a top attack. And Son, of course, with the historical legacy and this being a home fixture, just makes me think that Son is still a great captaincy option. Personally, I would still put Haaland above him just because I have much more confidence in the team for Haaland. They've shown that they've been able to do incredibly well without KDB in the meantime. Haaland, of course, has pretty much returned back to full form, I would say, in terms of just being able to actually finish and convert the amount of chances he gets per game. So that's going to be Haaland, first place captaincy. Second place captaincy is Son. Now, the third place captaincy and even a differential captaincy can actually go to a couple of suspects. I do think Eze, Solanke, and even Bowen are probably going to be the prime targets. Now, you could also put Saka in there, but I would also say that, just in terms of fixtures, I think Eze's fixture and Solanke's fixture are still better quality compared to, let's say, Bowen's fixture. Just because, of course, unfortunately, Sheffield United are just that much worse of a team. compared to Burnley. We've seen that this season, that Sheffield United really should be considered the worst defense in the Premier League. And there is a level difference, right? Even though, for example, Everton, of course, have been docked 10 points, and we know that the relegation spots are now between the promoted teams from last season and also Everton. The reality is we still look on underlying stats and we can still see that Sheffield United is still clearly the worst defensive team. So I do think Solanke is a great fixture here. Same with Eze here in terms of Luton Town away. And then, of course, Bowen, gets the benefit of that Burnley team. Bowen might be the differential captaincy based on the fact that he could be playing centre forward. It really depends on how you ascribe how good a West Ham centre forward is. I think for Son, we've seen that playing centre forward is crucial to how good he is viewed, as an asset. Whereas with Bowen, for example, I think the concern with West Ham is just watching stylistically and looking at, for example, Antonio's underlying stats in previous seasons. It's not necessarily the case that Bowen playing centre forward means he's a better pick, but that's something we still need to be able to judge. If Antonio's out, we can judge. And I think one of the things in terms of taking a differential captaincy punt is that you can make that chance here this week, right? Punt ahead, expect that Bowen's going to do better at center forward, and then go for that punt. So I would say my captaincy options are between Eze, Solanke, and Bowen. For me, Saka is still someone who I would take out. I just think that, unfortunately, even though this is Brentford away, look, it's just a much worse fixture. And even though Arsenal are so good, I just really think that it's tough to see Saka even getting 90 minutes because he's always someone who's been dealing with injuries this season, and he's not even a shout for me. So my captaincy options would be Haaland and then Son, and then obviously take your pick between Eze, Solanke, and Bowen. I don't imagine any of us own 2 out of 3 of them or 1 out of 3. I think if you own one of the 3 and you have those players in your team, then do consider that differential captaincy punt. But those would still be my third place players. And in terms of free at 13, the only logic I would say is that everyone's going to be suffering together in Game Week 13. Everyone's going to have a slightly worse team. Unfortunately, all the teams, the good teams at least, play versus each other. And that's one of the things that, for example, where if I even had to compare to, let's say, free at 18, that's the big difference. On free at 18, we know that people will be carrying at least 20 million or something on their bench, right? If you have Mbeumo, if you have Haaland, that's your 20 million gone. As far as, let's say, Game Week 18 as well, you can at least invest into one of the top teams who actually have a good fixture, right? Because this week in Game Week 13, we just talked about the captaincy options. It's Haaland with a bad fixture, it's Son with a pretty medium fixture, and then it's also teams between, let's say, Crystal Palace, Bournemouth, and West Ham who have pretty good fixtures, but also do you have full confidence in how explosive they can be in any of those singular games just because they're away fixtures? Not really, in my opinion. Whereas in Game Week 18, you can actually even look at something like Isaac, right? Being able to bring him into your team, that's such a huge upside. Plus, you get the 20 million in the bank that is going to be guaranteed that you can spend from a budget point of view versus the field. And so that's why I think in Game Week 13, just wouldn't consider the free hit at all. But that's it for this video in terms of the preview. It's quite a long preview, but I've had the time in the international break to actually do the preview. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys haven't seen the videos before, please feel free to like and subscribe, even comment. That really helps with the algorithm. We're trying to get to 20,000 subscribers at the end of this year. And otherwise, I hope you guys have lovely green arrows, and I'll see you guys in the next video.